So, what is the impact of the background lore revealed in the Timeless Children on Gallifreyan history? Well, not a lot. And everything. Doctor Who has had many different and often conflicting tales from the dark times of Gallifrey's past. I've made a video exploring one of these formation eras recently, so that when this episode aired, we'd have some comparisons. A common theme that reoccurs, however, is that the only tales from this time are either mythology or recounted by those who founded Gallifrey, often depicted as Omega and Rassilon, one of which was lost in its formation, and the other who was obsessed with his own immortality and legacy. Basically, there is no reliable narrative from this time. Spoilers ahead, naturally, but before we begin critiquing the new canon, let me ask you a question. Does the Doctor, being the timeless child with now seemingly infinite regenerations, cheapen the impact of a Doctor's death? They're no longer one step closer to the end, effectively immortal now, although still not invulnerable. Just a question I'm pondering. And the chief concern I have with this revelation from Series 12. If the Master's interpretation of the data can be trusted. Alright then, so what the hell does it all mean? Well, the Master brings the Doctor to his ruined Gallifrey to gloat and reveal his discoveries to her. Sometime before we saw him as the Spy Master O, he was on Gallifrey once more, messing with the Matrix. Well, the Gallifreyan Matrix has long been established in Time Lord society and is the repository of a Time Lord's knowledge where at the end of their final life, their mind is added to the collective library of information at the heart of the Citadel. It has a myriad of uses, not just to preserve knowledge, but it could facilitate communications throughout time and be used as a possibility engine to predict and prophesize. An individual's consciousness could enter the Matrix, sometimes even with the physical form reduced to biodata. In Classic Who, the Doctor had visited the Matrix several times before, once to chase down the Valeyard, a renegade dark splinter of the Doctor, but that's a whole nother story. Back on track. While toying with the Matrix looking to see what mischief he could cause, the Master stumbled across heavily redacted sections of memories and the story of the Timeless Child. Although heavily edited and deleted, some earliest parts of the narrative remained, although these too had been encoded beneath a false narrative to better hide it. The story of Brendan, a found child who joined the police of early 20th century Ireland, miraculously survived a fall from a cliff and went on to have his mind wiped on retirement. We can revisit all this at the end. Decoding this filter over the true history revealed buried Gallifreyan lore. Tecteun, one of the earliest pioneering Gallifreyan explorers, had constructed a spaceship and began to explore the universe. This was very early on in the universe's history, maybe comparable or even the actual dark times themselves. At this epoch of Gallifrey, they referred to themselves as the Shobogans, which is a term derived from the Classic era and used to refer to the outsiders of Gallifrey, people who, in contemporary Time Lord society, had shunned their way of life and lived as natural Gallifreyans in the drylands around the Citadel. Tecteun discovered the boundary between dimensions, a tear in reality, but more strangely, a deserted child. Being a curious scientist, Tecteun took the child back to Gallifrey to study and raise it, after continuing to adventure together for some time. However, she could not make heads nor tails of its physiology until one day. The child fell from a cliff's edge in the ravines of the Red Planet and died. But then the child regenerated. Bursting with light and an unknown power, it was the first regeneration on Gallifrey, and the child was restored to life in a new form. Tecteun returned to her labs to study the child more now, motivated by this strange ability, and over the course of its life, it regenerated several more times, each time into a new form. Now, how this ability works is still never disclosed in the show, but Tecteun eventually managed to synthesize a way to pass the ability on. she alters her genetic code with that of the Timeless Child's, and instantly, in her twilight years, she regenerates into a new form. A new era is born. The Gallifreyans now had created a power to extend their lives, but Tecteun decided a limit was needed. He restricted the regeneration cycle to 12 times, 13 lives in total. Now, this ties into another old theory that's been soft canon in Classic Who and was confirmed in New Who, and that is that the 12 regeneration limit was artificial. Originally, in the Fourth Doctor's time, it was commonly accepted that the 12 regenerations was the natural limit of the ability, but by the Time War, the Master had been granted a new cycle, and eventually the Doctor too. Well, supposedly. Prominent character and former president Rassilon is said to have uncovered the secret to perpetual regenerations, but he never passed that knowledge on, and for a long time he slumbered, dead for all intents and purposes in the death zone on Gallifrey, entombed forever with his secrets. However, with the Time War, Rassilon was returned and restored as president, perhaps bringing with him the secrets he had uncovered to uncapping the regeneration limit. Here I want to make a quick speculation. What if Tecteun became Rassilon? Tecteun injected herself with the ability to regenerate before the Time Lords were even formed, and it was limited to 12. Rassilon supposedly never revealed his methodology of immortality, so could the two be one and the same? Anyway, more food for thought. But the founding fathers of Gallifrey went on to establish the Citadel and the Time Lord Academy, found the chapters and organised those chosen Gallifreyans into a ruling caste, the Time Lords, gifting its members with the mantles of time travel and regeneration. The Master then goes on to insinuate that the Doctor is in fact the Timeless Child, and the very notion that the Doctor, always given preferential treatment, was also the same entity responsible for the Time Lord's greatest breakthroughs, drives him to spitefully lash out at Gallifrey and raze it to the ground. Somehow. The explanation for why the Doctor does not know this seems to be that a small section of Time Lords who knew the truth about him constantly wiped the child's memory upon regeneration, thus hiding the Timeless Child among their ranks forever. It perhaps was not until the Doctor stole a TARDIS and ran away that he was beyond their grasp and allowed to persist, seemingly as a regular Time Lord, none the wiser that he in fact was privy to an ability only one other ever claimed to have, perpetual regeneration. As for this mysterious division that was introduced, well, this looks to be the organisation responsible for handling the Timeless Child and be an order dedicated to the manipulation of time in order to shape events where intervention is deemed necessary. Again, the whole notion of the Time Lord non-interference policy came much later in their in-universe history, after they'd already established themselves. Even then, they had their own celestial agencies that regulated timelines and so forth, so the idea that there was a secretive division that did interfere in the universe isn't really a shocker. It's also suggested that they, or Tecteun, placed the filters over the early parts of the Timeless Child's history in the Matrix. Maybe this was done on purpose, so that when all the information was redacted, some parts would survive the purge to be hopefully uncovered later. So there we have it, the origin of regeneration. From here on out, it seems that stories were concocted by the founders that buried its origin, and it became public knowledge that Rassilon, the great war hero that he was, also created regeneration. So this also firmly establishes genetic splicing as part of the regeneration formula. There is still the proof too that exposure to the time vortex plays some part as well. I believe that such exposure softens up the DNA, making it capable of receiving the new ability, like wetting clay before it's sculpted. This would still explain outliers such as River Song, who was conceived, exposed to the time vortex, and why young Gallifreyans selected to be Time Lords were exposed to the untempered schism at a young age. It prepared them to receive the trademark Time Lord power. So, like I said, these big reveals don't really do much to alter Gallifreyan history. For me, the reveal of the Doctor being established as the Timeless Child, it doesn't much bother me as much as I thought. The idea of prior regenerations to Hartnell's Doctor would. I think because of the sheer enormity of the reveal that there must have been hundreds or even thousands of prior forms of the child all throughout Time Lord history, it's grander than just trying to cram in several pre-First Doctor lives. Temporally, the Doctor might have been the same person all those years ago, but physiologically and biologically, with their memory being wiped and dropped off in the Gallifreyan orphanage, the First Doctor was still the first. This whole notion is almost a reinvention of the older lore that never quite panned out, that the Doctor was a reconstituted founder of Gallifrey, born of the same genetic material but a different individual long buried by Rassilon known as the Other. Giving regeneration an origin actually doesn't change much about Time Lord lore. Many already speculated that the Time Lord's monolithic and grand history was a fabrication told to hide their messier, more ignoble formation. The biggest concern for me is the implication that the Doctor, our hero character, has infinite regenerations, literally lives to throw away. Now, of course, as a series, writers were always going to find ways to extend the Doctor's lives anywho. The story never ends after all, but there's something lost by declaring the Doctor as no longer imperiled by running out of lives. I'm assuming of course that the Doctor was not limited in the same way the rest of the Time Lords were, as he is the origin of the ability. Also, I'm not sure I like the idea of the Doctor as being a chosen one, and I'm hoping that the Master's chip on his shoulder has led him to the wrong conclusion, but I don't think so. Anyway, that's my breakdown of the story, and let's not forget, the show is about change. You don't like this idea? Then give it a decade and someone else will add or adapt the mythos. Time changes everything. Remember when the Doctor was supposed to be half human? So I guess, thanks for taking the time to watch this video. Let me know why do you think Tecteun, Rassilon or the Division, why someone, buried the knowledge of the Timeless Child. Could it be that Rassilon didn't want the competition of a political rival in the form of a messianic figurehead? I've been Rick, and I'll see you later. Goodbye.